My name is Tracy Schreppberg, and I'm the Associate Director of the School of Social Work. We're really happy to have y'all here today, as well as our guest. This lecture series is made possible by the support of Dr. Dorothy Pearson. Would you please stand? Let everybody know who you are.
I believe the civil rights and human rights are germane to human existence. And when I say human existence, I mean to what every individual is entitled to. It may come out differently for one person or another because of other factors, but that the right to have this, to do this, to explore this, that one would not be held back on some artificial characterization like minority status or color of skin or gender or sexual orientation. I mean, those are givens. Those are things that each of us are born with, and we are put here to, to make our lives and make them as comfortable as possible, but not just for personal comfort, but for the whole society. I believe that one's personal comfort and satisfaction should not be just taken for granted without considering the whole, W-H-O-L-E, of society.
It's a real honor for me to tell you a little about Dr. Dorothy Pearson. She was born in Dearborn, Mississippi. It was a very small farming community. She was the youngest of 9 children. When she was 8, her family moved to Bogalusa, Louisiana, a small paper mill town. She graduated from high school in 1954, but she was unable to go to college full-time because she had to stay at home to help her family care for her older brother, who had just been in a major car accident. But at a very young age, her parents were determined that she would be the first in the family to obtain a college degree. Her parents had made many sacrifices throughout their life for their dream that their youngest would get a college education, would become a reality. Though they had little money, they sent her to a private boarding school for high school so that she could be exposed to a broader environment. So during the week, she would help care for her brother, but on Saturdays, she would travel to Southern University in Baton Rouge, about 90 miles away, to take a college course or two. One Saturday, one of her professors at Southern gave her a note. The professor had seen her passion, her determination, and her intellect, and had arranged for Dorothy to receive a full scholarship to Southern, allowing her to attend full-time. She graduated from Southern University in 1958 and had been accepted to graduate school at both Atlanta University and Fisk University, both historically black institutions. Fortunately for us, the heat and humidity is oppressive in Louisiana in the summer, and Dorothy decided in the summer to take a vacation and see her brother in Milwaukee. During her 5 days in Milwaukee, she fell in love with the cool breezes off Lake Michigan. Also, the South was deeply segregated in the 1950s, and she wanted to find out what was on the other side and how would she fare in an integrated academic environment. The next chapter in Dorothy's life should make us all feel proud. It makes me especially feel proud of my connection to the School of Social Work and to the University of Wisconsin in Madison. As doors were opened here, when in many parts of the country doors were sealed shut to African Americans seeking a higher education. It was the summer of 1958, and Dorothy decided to apply to the University of Wisconsin School of Social Work. The admissions deadline for the fall had long passed, but Dorothy met with John Teeter, the assistant dean of the School of Social Work, and Max Kurtz, the field director, and they were so impressed with Dorothy that they made an exception. They opened the door, they allowed her to apply, and they admitted her to the School of Social Work. Now that Dorothy had been admitted, she had to figure out how to pay her out-of-state tuition bill. At that time, they had tuition scholarships for outstanding out-of-state graduate students. And Dorothy had the good wisdom to know that she was an outstanding graduate student, or would become one. But when Dorothy inquired about such a scholarship, she learned that they had already been allocated. But again, Dorothy was a determined young woman and contacted the dean of the graduate school. The dean must have been equally impressed as the School of Social Work faculty was with this young woman's determination and passion for attaining a graduate degree, as he was able to secure an additional out-of-state fellowship for Dorothy. Other doors were opened by people in the field. She went on to obtain a master's degree in psychiatric social work, and she worked for several years at the Milwaukee County Mental Health Center and as a member of the clinical faculty at UW-Milwaukee. She eventually returned to Madison to receive her Ph.D. in 1973. During her doctoral work, she founded the Wisconsin Association for Black Social Workers. Her dissertation on social class and mental retardation was selected by the American Association on Mental Retardation as an outstanding contribution to the knowledge in the field. With a PhD in hand, Dr. Pearson accepted a joint faculty appointment at the University of Miami School of Medicine and Barry University School of Social Work. In 1975, she took a position at Howard University. She established the first Ph.D. program in social work at Howard and became its first director. She remained at Howard until her retirement in 1999. The National Association of Social Work in 1999 bestowed on her its highest honor, the honor of being named a social work pioneer. During her career, Dr. Pearson conducted research regarding the educational, social, and family life of professional African American women, and she edited and published the book Perspectives of Equity and Justice in Social Work. In 1993, she wrote, "Despite the many years of discussion and various actions taken, the goal of achieving equity and social justice for oppressed groups in society is not now a reality. There is much to know and to do. It is imperative that social work educators and practitioners continue to address the issues of equity and social justice. This knowledge is essential in the formulation of intervention strategies that are acceptable and appropriate to the clientele and thereby more likely to be successful." These words are as true today as they were when originally written. Dr. Pearson is passionate about issues of equity and social justice for all and committed her life's work towards this goal. It is the hope that this lecture series will play a role in helping make the achievement of equity and social justice for oppressed groups a reality. We are very proud, Dr. Pearson, to have you among our graduates and very appreciative of your support for this lecture series.
I first met Morris as an undergraduate senior in our social work, in his social work major in our program, 1975-76. I found him a very serious student, especially as regarded human rights, and he had an excellent sense of humor. Over the years, I occasionally heard of Morris via students in my classes who were from his Beth Jacob congregation in the St. Paul area in Minneapolis. They spoke of him with appreciation and with affection, and I was startled a bit to realize that they knew I existed. I heard from Morris in 2000, in the year 2000. He was working on writing his spiritual autobiography and contacted me as part of his thanking his teachers for their effects on him. I wonder if he knew he is one of my most memorable students and was an intellectual and ethical influence. When I invited him to be a speaker at my own party last year in May 2011, my celebration of field teaching years, I did a web search so I could learn something more of Morris, and it led me to some evidence of the great things he has been doing. I will mention those, but he will share more with you. And I want to talk about some evidence for me of qualities of greatness. It was a pleasure to have Rabbi Allen and his wife, Dr. Phyllis Gorin, join me for that big celebration. And it's a pleasure to see you here today and to hear you again. Now, as to the honor, for me, it is an honor to be in the presence of greatness and to be inspired by it. 2 times before in my life, once in childhood, once about 15 years ago, I found myself in close interaction with a person recognized in our nation or in our state as a great leader. I believe I can summarize from that experience briefly what those qualities are. Being guided by a higher ethical authority and higher ideals. A discerning mind that sees through the complexity to the moral imperative. Quiet, unassuming courage in the face of daunting issues. Tenacity, dogged tenacity, in working through pragmatic goals, truly reflecting the ideals, despite powerful opposition and severe criticism, despite betrayals by trusted allies, despite indifference of the larger social environment, and other reversals on a long and tiring road. Dogged tenacity. Willingness to personally do the hard work, to take action, to model the labor. And finally, to operate with humility, despite increasing recognition and successes, and stay guided by that higher authority. Now, as to his work, I have greatly abbreviated my talk. So I will say that you will find Morris all over the web if you wish to Google Rabbi Morris Allen, and be brief on a couple of comments on him and his honors. This is from a web essay by Louis Naiman called Kosher Gets Ethical. Rabbi Morris Allen has a history of involvement in issues such as prison reform and immigration rights, and has been leading the push for Magen Tzedek during the last 5 years. His honors, I chose a few. He is recognized as one of the top 50 rabbis in the USA, those who are at the forefront of American Jewish leadership, rabbis who are reimagining ritual, reinventing institutions, mobilizing social activism, and energizing scholarship. They personify the most important roles in Jewish leaders as selfless listeners, teachers, connectors, and galvanizers. His Beth Jacob congregation has received 10 Solomon Schlechter Awards for innovative programming. His congregation has been recognized by Newsweek in 2009 as one of America's most vibrant Jewish congregations.
The means by which we were trained in the school to both be, concerned about an individual and concerned about societal change was something that I believe Mogen Tzedek represents in very serious and significant ways. I also believe that, you know, the model of social work training that I received long ago, which is probably not exactly the model used today, the Pincus Minahan target system work has been instrumental in my own life, and I think that the field of social work is so significant, both in terms of the compassion that it holds for the individual dignity and the belief in the importance of bettering society.
The reality, let me just say a word about Rosemary, and then a word about Dr. Pearson. The Hebrew word for teacher has the same root as parent. And Horim, our parents, Morim, our teachers. And our tradition says that just as parents bring us into this world, a teacher brings us into the next world. And it is really, I think, very true that not only does one remain in a teacher-student relationship, but a teacher that impacts on a human being's life is a gift to that individual. And I am very privileged to have received the gifts from you in your teaching with me. I'm not sure that you know what it means when a rabbi takes off his watch. Absolutely nothing. So just some flyers for later. I'm not sure if anyone would have imagined, not me, not my professors, not the school itself, that one day a then 22-year-old MSSW would be asked back to campus 35 years later to speak about the education he ran through in a 4-year period in the mid-1970s in order to honor a woman whose brilliant career and commitment to equity and social justice is truly inspirational. May your voice continue to be heard and to inform ours for many years to come. Thank you for all that you have done. But in truth, the die was cast early on. While Dr. Pearson received her Ph.D. in the summer of 1973, I arrived on campus that fall, a young, quite nervous 18-year-old. One has to remember that in the fall of 1973, the world seemed to be falling apart. On September 11th, 1973, shortly after the start of my first year as an undergraduate at Madison, Salvador Allende was overthrown in Chile, and General Pinochet came to power. Our campus held many gatherings to address that coup. This came on the heels of a summer when we were fixated on watching Senator Sam Ervin slowly and carefully with that Southern drawl dissect the Watergate tragedy piece by piece with seemingly that Southern drawl that was truly backed up by a deep desire to uncover the truth about Watergate and the excesses of a presidency. But the fall took on darker tones as well as the semester unfolded. On Yom Kippur that day, as I sat in the Hillel building across the street from this building, Egypt and Syria unleashed a surprise attack on Israel as the country and the world Jews observed our holiest day of the year. Then 4 days later, on October 10th, 1973, Spiro Agnew resigned as vice president, and for the first time in its history, CBS News spent an hour with Walter Cronkite, leading us through both the Agnew resignation and the battles unfolding in the Middle East. For a little comic relief that fall, there was Bobby Riggs playing Billie Jean King in tennis, reminding us that gender equity wasn't too far off our agenda either. But where it remains most vivid in my memory from all of those critically important events, life-changing events in some ways, all of them, was a comment made to my first class on the University of Wisconsin campus by the first social work professor I ever met. I believe it was Fred Seidel, who began his class in the Introduction to Social Policy with the following comment. He said, and I remember it as if it was yesterday, I'm going to tell you one thing. Most of you are taking your first social work class. Many of you are freshmen sitting here. Here is the truth I need to share with you. Decisions you make about your life at 18, you are going to have to live with when you are 36. Its profundity was not in its originality, but rather in its timing. At a moment when the world around me seemed filled with both promise of being a student at truly one of America's premier universities, and at a moment when America itself seemed at a critical turning point in its political and social makeup, Professor Seidel framed our lives with a vision of what really mattered. That is, seeing in our decision-making process that each of us must undertake a need for an enduring vision of who we are, what we want to accomplish with the gift of life we have been given, and the fact that each decision builds upon previous decisions which we have made. That is not to say that we are unable to change courses, indeed we are. But it does say that there is a traceability aspect to our lives that can be best understood by what Kierkegaard once said, that life is lived looking forward, but only understood by glancing backward. As I glance backward some 39 years ago to that first encounter with this Department of Social Work, I am moved by the impact that this school has had on my development, how both the education and training which I received have framed both consciously and non-consciously the work that has defined my professional life, and how I am filled with awe, truly filled with awe, that I have been asked back to this school to deliver this talk. There have been many honors in my life, many joyous moments to celebrate, but this is truly one of the most meaningful, and to be in your presence is truly an honor. There is much to say about social work and social justice. Indeed, the tension between fixing a problem and fixing a systemic issue that produces problems is something that social workers and social work has struggled with for a long time. There is often a need to help an individual address serious issues with which they live. Good social workers understand that truth daily and go about helping and empowering individuals to address debilitating issues which limit their personal growth and their ability to live life with meaning, joy, or happiness. And yet there are times when addressing the individual, when seeing the individual divorced from the societal reality in which they live, fails to address the root causes of the issues which the individual might be struggling with. At the same time, believing that every issue has a systemic origin removes individual responsibility and thus paralyzes an individual who must address his or her own reality in order to live more fully. That truth, learned in my social work education, has been immeasurably significant in my work as a congregational rabbi for 26 years. Indeed, I initially believed that acquiring my MSSW would be a good backdrop to a career in the rabbinate, providing me with excellent pastoral skills in counseling and caring. What I failed to understand and to truly appreciate was that the orientation with which a good social worker lives, living in that dialectical tension between the needs of the individual and the needs to address societal ills, actually has been as significant and as important to my life as a rabbi and my commitment to mending a society that is filled with brokenness and pain. This dialectical tension is ignored at our own peril. Social work practice oftentimes focuses exclusively on the dyadic relationship between a caseworker and a client, but failing to recognize the context, the power, and the limitations of the individual in relationship to their setting, and the unequal access to resources demands that as social workers we incorporate such thinking into our work as well. I have not functioned as a social worker in reality since I worked at a chronic care hospital in Roxbury, Massachusetts, after completing my MSSW and prior to beginning my rabbinical school studies. And yet the manner by which I have functioned as a rabbi, both in the micro and macro sense, has been defined by the understanding of the dialectical nature, or this dialectical nature of social work practice. But I want to focus in the main on my work around developing an ethical seal for the production of kosher food, an issue that I believe is at the heart of equity and of social justice. In order to do that, however, I will need to explain a little here and there about the laws of Kashrut, the Jewish dietary laws themselves, and share with you how a narrow reading of those laws perpetuates a system of worker abuse and denigration of human dignity. At the same time, it is important to state from the start that my own commitment to Kashrut is central to my own being. And so when confronted with the reality that some of its production was compromised as it related to human dignity, animal welfare, and environmental stewardship, my choice was simple. Address the problem to fix it. Don't discard the beauty of Kashrut because in our current societal setting, the corporatization of kosher food production has compromised some of our most salient ethical values. I should say that it has been easier to envision than to accomplish, but our work continues, and we remain convinced of the value of our work and the importance it holds for the kosher consumer, and indeed, more importantly, for the fulfillment of our ethical values as Jews, for human dignity and the dignity of labor. Indeed, much of my congregational life has been devoted to the fulfillment of the laws of Kashrut, dietary laws which define what one can and cannot eat, and how through the most mundane of tasks which we are as people are required to do in order to live, that of eating, can bring God's presence more fully into our lives. Kashrut, similar to what halal does for engaged Muslims, defines much of my daily connection to Jewish living. Were this a theology lecture, I could share with you why it is that only 2 of the 3 Abrahamic faiths, Jews and Muslims, have dietary laws, while Christianity eliminated them as part of its origins. But that lecture is part of a different series. For most of my congregational career, I have cajoled and encouraged people to internalize and live out the laws of Kashrut, the Jewish dietary laws. This was indeed part of my congregational crusade, and I continue to do so. In 1995, I received a little notoriety for establishing a campaign called Chew by Choice. You can always tell the Jews in the room. Whereby I encourage folks to climb a ladder of Kashrut observance, beginning by eliminating the pig from their diet. For the better part of my rabbinate, I also spend an inordinate amount of time working on behalf of immigrant rights. Like many silos with which we live, they appear to be disconnected parts of my being, although both share a common place of origin, sacred scripture, what Jews call Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Both grew out of the sacred foundational text we know as Hebrew scriptures. Indeed, in the book of Leviticus, the 3rd of the 5 books of Torah, we will read a section in this week on our Sabbath, coincidentally, that defines an animal as being kosher, being one that chews its cud and has split hooves. The 11th chapter of Leviticus, long a focus of cultural anthropologists, as a matter of fact, who have tried to discern an ethic for its fulfillment, shapes a great deal of my life. Indeed, the reason the pig became the poster animal for the most objectionable animal in Jewish life is that its outward appearance is such that it fulfills the rules of Kashrut. It has split hooves. To a person who lives on the surface, to someone who just looks at externals, the pig meets the criteria of being kosher. But on closer inspection, looking at its internal functioning, the pig fails the test. And so it is not accidental that the pig became the object of derision among Jews, for it appears to be acceptable, but in truth it is far from it. Similarly, my work on the rights of immigrants was bound up in the belief that while the Torah will tell us 3 times not to boil a kid in its mother's milk, which our earliest rabbi said meant not to mix milk and meat together. Another significant element of the Jewish dietary laws, by the way, 36 times the Torah will remind us to understand the heart of the stranger, for you were once strangers in a strange land. 12 times more often than reminding us how to eat, the Torah will demand from us concern for and attention to the marginal in our society, wherever and whenever we may be in time. For that reason, a central aspect of my rabbinate has been tied together in work on behalf of immigrants. In truth, both because of the Torah's constant reminder and because my own narrative is that of being blessed by the possibility of immigration into this country. Parenthetically, the earliest social workers were ones who understood that reaching out to the immigrant community and allowing them to fully enter into the fabric of this country is something that should make all of us who are social workers proud. The settlement house movement and the work of dedicated volunteers and social work professionals played a major role in the transformation of America from a country of Balkanized immigrant communities in the late 19th and early 20th century into helping shape a generation that embraced the American experience and the American ideal fully. Indeed, I often say that the only difference between a meeting of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the New York Psychoanalytic Association was this: one generation. My work on immigrant rights, indeed all of our work on immigrant rights, took a major hit on 9/11/01. Marginalizing every immigrant as a result of the behavior of a few was both politically expedient and tragically all too effective. One can look at campaign commercials run in the 2002 gubernatorial elections in state after state, and almost always there was an appeal to the worst and most base fears around immigrants. This, of course, was nothing new. The America Firsters in the early part of the 20th century, the anti-Semitic voices of Father Coughlin and of Charles Lindbergh, who, incidentally, I'm staying in the Lowell Inn tonight. I walked into my room and there was a picture of Charles Lindbergh receiving his honorary degree at the University of Wisconsin in 1928. But he was still an anti-Semite. Are all too easily heard in the vicious attacks on immigrants inside this country post 9/11. And yet, while the official voices may have been railing against the immigrant, in truth, the backstory is one of terrible human trafficking and corporate disregard for human dignity in the need to find labor willing to do the work that our society demands be done, but which we are no longer willing to do. Just to put it clearly in perspective, let's look at one clip from a movie about Postville, Iowa, and the massive immigration raid which took place in May of 2008. This clip will only identify the means by which the plant secured its labor, underscoring, of course, that food production could only occur as a result of the oppression of the labor.
The workers who came to Postville came for all the right reasons. They came to fill jobs that locals didn't want to take. And you know, their story is an American story. It's a story of economics.
No fui a hacer cosas que al país no le gustaban. Yo fui a trabajar. Venir en ese momento de derrota, destrozado por completo, pues para nosotros es una gran tristeza, porque imagínense, yo he perdido mi casa, ahora me arrepiento. Mejor no me hubiera ido, ¿para qué? Si lejos de ir a ganar, yo a perder. Guatemala es un país que ha sufrido tanto, ha sufrido desde el conflicto armado interno, que dejó una desintegración comunitaria, una desintegración familiar, que afectó profundamente el tejido comunitario. Junto a esto, hemos vivido una permanente violencia. La violencia en las comunidades, la inseguridad ciudadana es algo tan deprimente en Guatemala. Y a esto se une la pobreza. Y creo que lo más triste es cuando una familia ve morir los hijos de hambre, que ve a los hijos sin ninguna perspectiva de salir adelante con una carrera universitaria, con una carrera técnica y con medios de vivir, no medios para la muerte, sino medios de sobrevivir, medios de salir adelante, de aspirar una vida digna en este mundo.
So for young people with no future in Guatemala, really, to stay where they are is irrational. They have no future in Guatemala. So their hope is to go.
Sí, con cuidado. El migrante necesita trabajo, necesita buscar algún lugar que le dé el pan. Si no es gratis, que tenga facilidad de ir, va a pagar, tiene que pagar y es una inversión muy grande. Las políticas restrictivas se está fomentando el negocio humano.
At the height of the migration through the desert in Arizona between 2004 and 2006, somewhere between, just on the Tucson sector of the border, about 200 miles of the Arizona border, estimates were between 4,000 and 10,000 people crossing a day.
What this clip shows is just how it was possible for some 700 people from Central America to end up working in a small city in northeastern Iowa. What the clip fails to capture, however, is the expense involved, the danger involved, the way in which these lives are forever changed as a result of the double speak about undocumented workers in our country. While folks will rail against the porous nature of our border, they will turn a blind eye to the undocumented worker who cares for their lawn, who cleans their hotel room, who cooks in the diner, or who more likely is the laborer producing the food that will be on their plate tonight for dinner. But what this clip also fails to cover is how powerless these workers are in the face of living in company towns throughout America, in small town America, where the rent they pay is deducted from the short-checked paychecks, where the medical insurance they are promised is non-existent, where the smock they must wear is charged each and every pay period against their pay, where safety equipment was routinely broken and in non-compliance with OSHA standards, where short-checking became all too common, where dummy corporations existed so that after working 40 hours for agri-processors, they would see that instead of the overtime for the next 20 hours that they worked, they would instead be paid by a dummy company called Acme Cleaning on the same paycheck. You see, we can rail against migrant workforce and the fact that these jobs are being taken from Americans out of work, but it would be a lie. Working with a workforce that does not know the language, that is fearful for its own existence in a town in northeastern Iowa or in southern Minnesota in Winona, Fairmont, or in towns across this country, means that you can get away with paying them $6.75 an hour, when the average wage in 2006 on a killing floor in Iowa was then $11.25. It means that you can tell pregnant women who stand all day on a killing floor on a line with air scissors clipping chickens' legs that they can't take a bathroom break unless they can find another worker to take their place on the line. And there is no other worker to take their place. Or that these same pregnant women are given opportunities for prenatal care 20 minutes from the time they leave the line to unfrock, to get to the doctor's office, and to get back. And if it's longer than 20 minutes, their pay will be deducted. Or about the worker who lost his fingers and 3 weeks later was told that his workman's comp would be that he would be hired as a cleaning person in the third shift at 65 cents an hour less than he was paid before. Or the man who lost an eye because of the chemicals that were used on the killing floor, and there was no basin, according to OSHA standards, for him to rinse the chemical out of his eyes. And so it was here, in the understanding of both the need to support the importance of fidelity to Jewish dietary laws and the need to be attentive to and responsible for the stranger in our midst. That the silos of my life broke down, and that there was a means to see that in support for the migrant worker, we could do something significant for the kosher consumer, and the sanctity with which we as Jews live and maintain in our own consciousness. In order to fully appreciate the significance of Postville, Iowa, and of agri-processors, where at one point 70% of all kosher meat sold in America was processed, let us go back to just 35 or 45 years ago. When I was a child, our food distribution system was quite different. Most kosher meat was not produced in meatpacking plants. Kosher consumers did not go into grocery stores and select their food choices off the shelves as non-kosher consumers did. No, we had relationships with butcher shops, who in turn had relationships with a particular ritual slaughter, who then sold his slaughtered meat to a particular butcher in a particular city, who then sold it to the customer base that patronized that butcher shop. But American meat production in general, and kosher meat production in particular, changed dramatically during the mid-1970s, during the very years when I was here at Wisconsin. Indeed, before the exploitation of migrant workers, Iowa Best Beef began to change the way meatpacking plants worked and began to take what were once skilled jobs, whereby an employee knew the entire line of operation, and transform these jobs into unskilled labor, whereby workers only had a particular knowledge of one aspect of the line on which the animal was butchered. By doing so, IBB began to pay women and men differently at a time when that was even still legal, based on jobs that were to be done, and ultimately from that experience was able to break the union control over their plants. Indeed, up until that time, a unionized worker in a meatpacking house might be making the equivalent of $25 an hour in today's money, in the equivalent of 1970 monies. It was a job for middle-class people working in meatpacking plants, and people raised families, and sent children to college, having been meatpackers. Breaking the unions throughout the meatpacking industry only served to push middle-class wage earners, though, out of the industry, only to see them replaced increasingly by the most marginal in society. Increasingly, that group of workers became undocumented workers, whose backs produced the food that you and I ate in area after area. Indeed, Cesar Chavez in the 1960s and 70s achieved some prominence in organizing migrant workers who worked the fields of California. Grapes particularly became a focus of Chavez, and his organizing work and the work of the United Farm Workers served as a brief shining moment in the understanding of the need to address the most marginal worker, the ones whose sweat and toil allows for us to increasingly become disconnected from the production of the very food we regularly eat. To make a very involved story palatable, let me just say that I made my first trip to Postville in Iowa in March of 2006. At the time, it was merely to explore the possibility of securing a different type of kosher meat into the Twin Cities marketplace. And here's a little diversion again into Kashrut. For the sake of this discussion, suffice it to say that there are more stringent rules as to what constituted acceptable kosher meat, which have to do with the smoothness of a cow's lung, a concept called glot kosher. However, non-glot meat, where a cow's lung may not be as smooth and may have a nodule or two on it, is still strictly kosher. However, since the price margin for glot meat is higher, and as a result of the corporatization of the kosher meat production, in part due to agri-processor success, away from the local butcher shop, glot meat became the standard and served as another reason or excuse why some Jews chose not to keep kosher. It was too expensive. As a result, I first went to Postville to see if I could arrange, together with an Orthodox colleague, the delivery of non-glot meat to the kosher consumer in the Twin Cities. On that first visit in March of 2006, I walked the plant of agri-processors for the first time. And what did I see? A plant where 70% of the kosher meat sold in America was being produced, was being produced by the work of a nearly total Spanish-speaking workplace. While driving home from that first visit, I said in the car that if indeed the Sensenbrenner legislation, Congressman that you in Wisconsin know all too well, which was then being debated in Congress, were to pass, the entire kosher meat industry would have come to a screeching halt. However, it was only in May of that year, after our successful introduction of this non-block meat back into the local marketplace occurred, and coincidentally prices for both tribes of kosher meat went down significantly, that it became apparent that the Jewish community was becoming complicit in the exploitation of cheap labor in the production of its own kosher meat. Not unlike the stories which came out of the sweatshops in the early part of the 20th century, where cheap labor was exploited in the making of clothes and other textiles among the immigrant population. Now the situation was such that Hispanic labor, mostly from the mountain country of Guatemala, was producing the food which we are required to eat. And not unlike The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which detailed the horrific nature of meatpacking in this country a century ago, Postville, Iowa became a replica of both. After the appearance of that article in the May of 2006 Forward, I organized a group to investigate the veracity of the claims. We spent the better part of the summer of 2006 talking on the phone with anyone who we might be able to talk to, clergy in Postville, store owners, politicians, all in preparation for a visit in August of 2006. We then spent 2.5 days there, 5 of us, meeting with everybody. The Iowa Department of Labor, the management of the plant, taking a 3-hour tour of the facilities, meeting with employees and laborers, all in hopes of fixing a broken plant. We toured the housing units built on the outskirts of Postville. New units, 2-bedroom units, only to be told by the senior management of Agri that these people are very clannish. They live 2 and 3 families to a unit. In truth, it was the only way to make sure that rent could be made. For the rent, often deducted right from their paycheck, was $525 a month at $6.75 an hour. If you got paid for all 40 hours a week and you worked 4 weeks, figure the math out and the need or what these people need to do in order to survive. Initially, I was like a social worker who had a single client. In this case, agri-processors. Surely we could work with them, help them understand that by changing their behavior, good work would flow towards them. Good would flow towards them. Our initial desire was simply to help them fix their own problem, a classic social work approach. We proposed 3 measures for the plant to undertake after that visit to Agri. We asked the management to invite the Iowa Department of Labor into the plant to address health and safety and environmental concerns, all things suggested by the then Iowa Commissioner of Labor, Dave Neal. That would have given the plant 18 more months to address all of these issues without threat of a raid. We asked that all training and training materials be in the vernacular of the worker, in this case actually very simple Spanish, since we discovered that most of the workers were not only illiterate in English, they were illiterate in classic Spanish. Finally, we suggested that a series of meetings between the management of the plant and the workers be arranged, with facilitators that our investigative group would provide, whereby workers would be able to address the abuse and harassment which was evident in the lives of the workers at this plant, and which the senior management had been careful to avoid fully knowing by insulating themselves in a most Machiavellian plot. Let me explain. Post 9/11, it was almost impossible for undocumented workers to get driver's licenses in any state. Now, before I go on, I know there are many students here who are able to acquire appropriate driver's licenses so they can drink in any bar in Madison at any time. But the reality is that undocumented workers, it was nearly impossible to get driver's licenses officially in any state. Of course, that didn't stop them from obtaining illegal licenses, often arranged through the Human Resources Department of the agri-processors, again at a horrific price, or simply driving without a license and having the community law enforcement turn a blind eye. Indeed, if one showed up at the parking lot at this plant on any workday and at any shift, one would have discovered that it was filled with cars. And here's where the Machiavellian nature, the management of Postville, of agri-processors, is understood. Almost all of them were purchased from the main manager of the plant, a man named Hassan Amara. The ultra-Orthodox plant owners had hired 2 Palestinian brothers to bear the brunt of the disdain for the cruelty of the workplace, in exchange for allowing them to run side businesses that included forcing workers to buy cars from them, sexual and other forms of extortion, and mistreatment that was oftentimes violent and hardly ever reported. Or the fact that in a 6-month period in this plant there were 5 amputations reported, making it the most egregious meatpacking plant for safety in the state of Iowa at the time. Or the fact that we interviewed kids who were 15 years old and working on the killing floor, a clear violation of U.S. law which forbids anyone under the age of 18 to work on a USDA supervised plant floor. In the summer of 2008, Representative Luis Gutierrez and several other representatives came to Postville and watched for a minute what they discovered.
After that trip is concluded, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.
Allí sufrí bastante porque yo no aguantaba mucho en ese trabajo porque agarré mucha la tijera y se me quedaban mucho las manos y en eso que nos trataban mal, nos regañaban, siempre nos daban trabajo duro, a veces nos tiraban agua de carne y a veces se me hinchaba la mano, a veces tenía mucho sueño cuando yo regresaba. Ni ganas de hacer nada. Y gracias a la iglesia que nos están ayudando bastante y en eso estamos saliendo. Y les agradezco a todos y muchas gracias.
Dígame cuántos años tienes.
Yo tengo 16 años y trabajaba casi las 12 horas. Y yo no aguantaba porque era duro el trabajo y muy pesado.
Déjame hacerte una pregunta. ¿Alguien en la fábrica, supervisor tuyo, sabía de tu edad?
Bueno, una supervisora me preguntó cuántos años tienen, le dice 16 cumplidos, le dije. ¿Por qué? Le dije. Solo preguntaba, pero si ella me preguntó, yo le dije la verdad.
You had Iowa Workforce Development since March trying to get kids to talk to them. No one wanted to talk to Iowa Workforce Development. They didn't know who they were, what they wanted. The only thing they knew is that they were asking questions and that they were the government. It wasn't until I explained to them, what has happened to you is a crime in this country. If you help the investigators with their investigation, they can protect you. And all of a sudden, they had rooms full of kids wanting to talk to them.
¿Habían otros niños en la fábrica trabajando?
Sí, a veces eran más menores que yo.
Menores que tú, trabajando en la fábrica.
¿Hay otros niños que están aquí hoy? ¿Quienes trabajaban?
Los jóvenes que están aquí trabajaban en la fábrica.
Sadly, the senior management of this plant refused to accede to our recommendations and instead continued with the worker abuse and exploitation, only to be raided by Immigration and Customs Enforcement in May of 2008. But here there is no justice, because while he no longer runs the plant, the agency of the federal government that should have raided the plant was the Labor Department. For it was truly a plant where over and over, labor abuse was the norm, not the exception. But the dignity of labor is not talked about as a value in this society. We are more comfortable blaming and railing against those who seek a better economic future by paying exorbitant sums of money to cross our border, and yet who find themselves in hellholes like Postville, Iowa, instead bearing the brunt of producing the food which I am required to eat. So our attempt to address this plant was doomed from the start, because there was a systemic situation at play, and unless we addressed the system itself, no single plant would ever change its practices or its behavior. My community, Jews, had become more interested, sadly, in the smoothness of a cow's lung than in the safety of a worker's hand. How was it possible that Kashrut, which was intended to ensure that eating is an act of holiness, bringing the sacred into the lives which we are to lead, had become defiled by the abuse of human beings and denigration of human dignity? As a voice which had for years encouraged fidelity to Kashrut, and which I still do to this day, how could I simply turn a blind eye to the abuses and corruption in the production of the food which fulfilled one piece of legislation in the Torah, but failed to uphold many other pieces of legislation which demand appropriate guarantees for workers, dignity for the marginal in society, and honesty in business practices? In the language of the Torah itself, fair weights and measures. The rules in Leviticus that detail the kind of animals that are fit for consumption are not written in large letters, and the rules about employee responsibility in Deuteronomy are not written in small letters. They are written in the exact same size of letters. Like a social worker who realizes that fixing an individual problem each and every day is sometimes simply a band-aid for a much larger sore that needs addressing, together with several colleagues, we began work on developing a standard of ethical behavior, a seal of justice that could be applied to any product that is produced as a kosher product in this country. We have now developed the most extensive set of standards ever proposed in 5 interlinked areas: wages and benefits, health, safety and training, corporate integrity, environmental stewardship, and product development, which includes animal safety. Initially, these standards were developed by a wonderful food science professor at Cornell University, Dr. Joe Regenstein. Taking his standards, Social Accountability Accreditation Services, a social auditing firm based in New York, a firm which has developed an international labor standard known as SA 8000, has turned them into auditing standards, which will now allow us to work with companies in having them secure this certification. These standards now represent a gold standard for the food industry in terms of ethical production of their product. And while we have now sent out three contracts to companies, 3 applications to companies, I wish I could tell you that the industry, even the progressive food industry like Stonyfield Farms and Ben and Jerry's, have just eaten up our standards with relish. But in spite of this fight will probably be a more challenging one than addressing the abuses of a single plant. There is reason for hope, and there are firms that see ethics as not only as always important for the industry to uphold, but also for good business practices itself. In truth, kosher food production, not kashrut, but the production of kosher food has become too much like a pig. It was obvious from the outside that the food was kosher. It was certified and it was produced in ways that met the ritual standards for what constitutes kosher. But when one began to peel back the layers, one began to see a disturbing situation where the surface told one story and the inside told another. In truth, in this case, the food was really still kosher. No one could claim it wasn't. But the other truth was that something wasn't kosher in the way it all came about. What Magen Tzedek, what the Seal of Justice is doing, is addressing a systemic situation that allows for those companies who already do right to be celebrated, to encourage those companies who are capable of achieving the standards to do so with support during their transition, and to identify those companies whose practices are so below the acceptable ethical norm of our people that while the food is kosher, the process makes it not so at all. Long ago, in what seems like a different life at times, I learned early on in this very department that we are all agents for change, that we must identify our change target, and that we must put a plan in place that will allow for the change to occur. For me, that grounding finds its home in the expression of an observant Jew who only seeks to fulfill the mission of mending the brokenness of the world in which we live. Had it not been for the work of this department years ago, had it not been for the integrity of the field that we call it our own, had it not been for professors like Fred Seidel and Rosemary Carbino, had it not been for the clarity of other professors who cajoled and encouraged us to thrive, neither the wonder and work of Dorothy Pearson and the legions of students that she can now call her own, or the more modest work that I have accomplished would have ever taken place. In truth, in the field of social work, we have a badge of distinction to wear, a badge that says change for the better is not only possible, it is the moral imperative with which we are to live. Thank you very much. Let me just say that the monopolization of certification in this country by one stream of the Jewish community is not a healthy thing for any of us. That being said, we have developed a good working relationship with the largest certifier of kosher food, the Orthodox Union, the little OU that you see on packages. Joe Regenstein, by the way, is a hero in that community because he was the one that got Oreo cookies to go from being not kosher to kosher, so that's a very important thing. Of course, the downside of that, by the way, was the end of Hydrox as a brand. Hydrox disappeared as soon as Oreos became kosher, but that's a whole nother story about the economics of certification. But the fact of the matter is that there is clearly an inability of some people in some aspects of the Orthodox community to deal with people who aren't Orthodox, to believe that human dignity extends to those who aren't Jewish, that the soul of a non-Jew may not be inhere with the same dignity as the soul of a Jew. And these theological stumbling blocks which they place before themselves create a great deal of anger directed most often towards me. Rosemary is very kind because you can Google my name and find kosher food and find some of the most horrific attacks leveled against me, except maybe once or twice by my kids. But anyway, no, they're actually much worse, and they're horrible, and and sometimes they were frightening in the midst of all this. But I think the good work is that I think that there are people of goodwill who understand that ethics have a real place in the discussion of food production in this country. The means by which it will work is that we will be working with Social Accountability International, which is the auditing form of SAAS, and they will, it's a whole different certification than kosher certification. We're not doing kosher certification. We're doing only ethical certification. So we will do a whole series of what are called desk audits first. People will have begun to send in forms so that we can review the forms. Then we'll make an on-site visit. Then the certification will be good for a 2-year period. And we have begun working with people who do social auditing, training them to our standards already. And then there will be certain kinds of experts, people in Jewish law and on ethical, that will also be involved. Here's a whole little dirty secret about Kashrut supervision that I really don't want to get into, but there is the appearance always of a conflict of interest, because the person who does the certification is only paid if indeed the product remains kosher. So you can always turn a blind eye to those kind of issues. So we have a wall between us and the people who do the auditing.
I'm curious about the pushback that you alluded to from companies that you're inviting to make application. What's the primary obstacle? And part 2 of my question is it your intent to invite application from companies that don't already have a hechsher?
No, and not initially. Let me start with the last question. A hechsher is the certification that a product is kosher for all the rest of us. And we want to begin by certifying that kosher food has been produced in an ethically appropriate fashion. We believe, and the research we have been able to undertake indicates that we're significant players in the kosher food industry to adopt our standards. The consumer staple companies, Kraft, General Mills, ConAgra, that it will have an unbelievable impact on all food production in this country. And we think that that's important. But we want to remain focused on certifying that food which is obligatory on some level for us to eat. In terms of the pushback, let me just say that again, unfortunately, living in a world in which many of us were complicit in allowing a small segment of a community to become the only ones who gave voice to the meaning of what is and isn't kosher, allowed for situations that we saw in this movie. The movie, by the way, is called Abused. It was produced by Luis Argueta, who is a Guatemalan filmmaker himself. It is a powerful movie about a raid and about the way in which the federal government, in many ways, and again, why I think the Labor Department should have been the department that came in, criminalized these people who were arrested. It was the first time in an immigration raid that immigrants were convicted of a felony as opposed to simply being deported. And the reason was, and to the federal government's defense in their mind, it then allowed these people who chose to turn and work with the government, but it really destroyed families. And there's so much to say about this, but given the short period of time I had to say it, I had to choose wisely, and I hope I did, in terms of what I did speak about.
Well, I think of significance is two things. One is it was the first lecture of the Dorothy Pearson lecture series in social justice and equity, which Dorothy Pearson, an alum of the School of Social Work, one of our first graduate doctoral students in 1973, has given a donation to the school to enable us to every year have a lecture about social justice and equity. And we were pleased that the first lecture was Rabbi Morris Allen, who's also an alum of the School of Social Work, having gotten his bachelor's and master's degree here, and has worked for many years on immigration rights, most notably workers' rights. And so he was an excellent, wonderful choice for the first series, and each year we plan to bring in another distinguished speaker to talk about major issues in social justice and equity.
I'm looking forward to other lectures in this series because I think in combination they can be of use to our students and faculty and other people who want to hear from persons who have committed their life work to achieving social justice in some areas.
I think that the role of social justice is to realize that human dignity needs to be at the forefront of any kind of work that we do. And when human dignity is compromised, then of course our work itself is compromised. And I think that the element of social justice that is found in many strands of social work practice allows us to see a world that can be bettered and that can be mended. And indeed that is a calling that I think social work asks of us.